No one can agree on the exact year the park stopped operating. Some say it was the late 1970s. Others insist it limped into the early 80s, barely alive, running on nostalgia and broken machinery. A few locals swear they remember lights flickering on as late as 1984, though no official records support that claim. What everyone agrees on is this: the park did not close. It simply stopped opening. There was no final weekend advertised in the newspaper, no farewell speeches, no commemorative souvenirs. One summer ended, and the next never began. The iron gates remained locked. The ticket booth windows stayed dark. And the sound that had once defined the area, music, laughter, the metallic shriek of rides, vanished without explanation. For a place built entirely on noise and movement, the silence was immediate and unsettling. The amusement park sat just outside a small town, close enough to hear when the wind carried sound, far enough away to be ignored when it didn't. It had been there for decades, long enough that most residents no longer questioned it. Children grew up with it in the background of their lives, like a permanent carnival that simply existed. It was where first kisses happened under flickering lights, where teenagers worked summer jobs operating rides older than their parents, where families posed for photographs that were never labeled because everyone already knew where they were taken. The park didn't have a famous name. In fact, most people just called it the park. The official title had faded from memory, along with the hand-painted sign that once hung above the entrance. The letters peeled and cracked long before the gates closed, as if the park had been slowly erasing itself from the highway. You could see the Ferris wheel. Even years after it shut down, the wheel stood taller than the surrounding trees. Its white metal frame had rusted into a dull orange, and several of the passenger cars were missing entirely, leaving skeletal arms reaching into empty air. For a long time, that Ferris wheel became the only proof that the park had ever been real, and then people started avoiding it. Not because it was dangerous, though it was, and not because it was illegal to trespass, though it was. They avoided it because something about the place felt wrong in a way that was difficult to explain without sounding irrational. Parents told their children to stay away, but never explained why. Teenagers joked about it, but refused to go alone. Adults changed the subject when it came up, as if the park were a bad memory best left untouched. There were no official reports of deaths linked to the park. No famous accidents. No tragic headlines preserved in local archives. On paper, it was an unremarkable failure. Another small amusement park that couldn't compete with bigger attractions. And yet, people remembered things that were never written down. They remembered rides stopping suddenly for no reason. They remembered lights going out while people were still strapped in. They remembered employees who quit without notice and never came back. Most unsettling of all, they remembered a specific night, a night no one could quite place on a calendar, when the park stayed open later than usual. That night became the dividing line between before and after. The park was originally built in the post-war boom, when optimism was cheap and land was plentiful. A local businessman saw an opportunity, a place where families could escape the routine of factory shifts and quiet streets, even if only for an afternoon. Construction was rushed. Corners were cut. Rides were purchased secondhand from traveling carnivals and refurbished just enough to pass inspection. Safety standards were flexible, but none of that mattered at the time. The park thrived. On summer evenings, traffic backed up for miles. Colored lights reflected off car windows as people waited to enter. Music spilled into the surrounding fields. The air smelled like fried dough, popcorn, hot metal, and spilled soda. From the outside, the park looked like a self-contained world, one where time didn't quite behave normally. Inside the gates, the sun always seemed to set later. The music never fully stopped. Even when rides broke down, which happened often, the park adapted, patched things together, and kept moving. It developed a reputation for being a little rough around the edges, but charming. Employees learned early not to question strange noises from machinery. Operators were trained to restart rides without calling maintenance. Guests were encouraged to keep moving, keep smiling, keep enjoying themselves. The park's mascot was a smiling character with exaggerated features, wide eyes, oversized hands, and a permanent grin painted onto a costume that trapped heat and sweat inside. No one remembers what the character was supposed to be. Some say it was a bear. Others think it was a cartoonish animal that never existed. The costume was passed down from employee to employee, rarely cleaned, often repaired with duct tape and thread. The person inside was anonymous, interchangeable. Years later, when photos of the mascot resurfaced online, people noticed something unsettling. The eyes didn't line up properly. One sat slightly higher than the other, creating an expression that felt less joyful and more strained. As if the smile were forced into place. At the time, no one cared. Children ran toward it. Parents took pictures. The mascot waved and posed and disappeared into the staff-only areas between appearances. Those areas, the spaces behind the rides, beneath platforms, inside maintenance corridors, were places guests never saw. They formed a second version of the park, darker and quieter, where the music faded into distant echoes. Employees referred to these areas as the back paths. They weren't marked on maps. They twisted and intersected in ways that didn't always make sense. New workers got lost there regularly, even after weeks on the job. Some claimed the paths seemed longer at night. Management dismissed these complaints as nerves, exhaustion, or imagination. After all, the park ran late. Long hours blurred perception. And perception, as it turns out, was the first thing the park began to distort. As the years passed, attendance slowly declined. Newer, safer parks opened farther away, offering bigger rides and cleaner attractions. The old park tried to keep up, adding new features where it could, repainting structures, replacing light bulbs. But the foundation was aging. Electrical systems failed more often. Rides stalled mid-motion. Maintenance logs became vague, then incomplete, then non-existent. Inspectors came less frequently. When they did, they were rushed. Employees learned to handle problems internally. Guests noticed oddities. A ride that stopped twice in the same place, a funhouse mirror that reflected someone who wasn't there, a tunnel ride where the music cut out halfway through, leaving only the sound of water dripping and machinery humming. Complaints were filed, then forgotten, until the night the park stayed open too late. No official record marks the date of that night. There are no newspaper articles, no police reports, no photographs stamped with a clear timestamp. What exists instead are fragments. Stories told years later, interviews recorded long after memories had time to shift and rot. But when those stories are compared, they line up in unsettling ways. It was a weekend night. The park was unusually crowded. A heat wave had settled over the area, making the air thick and restless. Several former employees recall being told to stay late, even though closing time had passed. One remembers checking their watch and realizing it was well past midnight, something that had never happened before. The music kept playing. Not the usual playlist, but a loop that repeated too quickly, skipping sections, restarting mid-song. Lights flickered in patterns that didn't match the rides. Some attractions continued operating even after operators left their posts. Guests noticed the exits were harder to find. Signs that had been clear earlier seemed dimmer. Pathways felt unfamiliar. The park, which people had walked 100 times before, suddenly felt rearranged. One family later claimed they spent nearly an hour trying to locate the front gate, circling the same food stands again and again. When they finally found it, the ticket booth was dark. The gates were still open, but no one was there. At some point during that night, a ride shut down and did not restart. Which ride it was depends on who you ask. Some say it was the Ferris wheel. Others insist it was a tunnel ride. Near the back of the park, a few remember screams near the old wooden roller coaster. What everyone agrees on is that something went wrong. Not in a mechanical sense, but in a way that made people stop trusting what they were seeing. Lights failed in sections, plunging rides into darkness while others remained brightly lit. Music cut out completely in some areas, while echoing unnaturally loud in others. The park felt uneven, like parts of it were out of sync. Employees attempted to guide guests toward exits, but found themselves separated, disoriented. Radios crackled with static. Instructions repeated, overlapped, or cut off mid-sentence. And then, without warning, the power surged back. Every light turned on at once. Every ride started moving. At least, that's how it was remembered. By morning, the park was closed, locked, silent, empty. Employees arrived for their next shifts to find the gates sealed and notices posted that simply read, "Closed until further notice." There were no explanations. Phone calls went unanswered. Paychecks stopped arriving. Management vanished. Within weeks, weeds began creeping through cracks in the pavement, as if the park had been abandoned far longer than it actually had. The rides were left where they stood, cars frozen mid-track. Booths stocked with prizes no one would ever win. Control panels still set to on. The mascot costume was never found. Neither were several employees who had worked that night. Officially, none of this happened. There were no missing persons reports tied to the park. No investigations. No public statements. It was as if the place had been quietly erased from the town's collective responsibility. And yet, long after the gates were locked, people reported seeing lights inside. Not bright ones. Not enough to suggest the park was operational. Just enough to suggest something was still there. Years later, explorers began sneaking in. Urban explorers, photographers, teenagers looking for a story to tell. Most didn't stay long. They described the same feeling within minutes of entering. A pressure in the air, a sense of being watched, a disorientation that made familiar layouts feel wrong. Cameras malfunctioned. Batteries drained unexpectedly. Audio recordings picked up sounds no one remembered hearing at the time. And always, there were reports of music. Faint, distant, looping. The kind that never quite reaches a satisfying ending. After the park closed, most people tried to forget it existed. That was easy enough to do during the first few years. The entrance road was blocked. The parking lot cracked and faded. Nature began the slow process of reclaiming what had never truly belonged to it in the first place. But the park itself refused to disappear. It loomed over the tree line, its tallest structures visible from miles away. The Ferris wheel never collapsed. The roller coaster never rotted enough to fall. Even the smaller rides, fragile things made of thin metal and aging plastic, remained stubbornly intact. As if something was holding them together. For those who had worked there, forgetting was not an option. Former employees reported dreams that followed the same pattern. They would find themselves back on shift, wearing uniforms they no longer owned, standing at rides that should not have been running. The dreams always ended the same way, with an announcement over the park speaker system, distorted and incomplete, calling them to a location they could never quite reach. When they woke up, they remembered the back paths. Those hidden corridors behind the attractions had always existed, but after the night the park stayed open too late, they took on a new significance. In hindsight, employees realized how much time they had spent there, how often they had been encouraged to use them instead of the main walkways. Officially, the back paths were meant for efficiency. They allowed workers to move between attractions without cutting through crowds. They housed electrical lines, storage areas, and maintenance access points. Unofficially, they felt like something else entirely. The walls were unfinished, bare concrete, exposed wiring, pipes that dripped constantly, even in dry weather. The lighting was uneven, creating long stretches of shadow between pools of harsh fluorescent light. Sound behaved strangely there. Music from the park filtered through the walls, distorted and distant, as if coming from underwater. Footsteps echoed too loudly, then disappeared entirely. Voices seemed to come from around corners that led nowhere. New employees were warned not to wander. Stay on the marked routes, supervisors would say. If you get lost, stop moving and call on the radio. But radios didn't always work back there. Sometimes they only played static. Sometimes they repeated earlier transmissions. Sometimes they played music. One former ride operator described a night shift when the park was nearly empty. They had been sent to check a ride near the edge of the park, a slow-moving attraction that took guests through a darkened tunnel filled with painted scenes and cheap animatronics. The ride had a habit of stalling, and management preferred employees to fix it quietly rather than shut it down. The operator entered through a back door and followed the maintenance corridor behind the tunnel. Halfway through, the music stopped. Not just for the ride, for the entire park. The sudden absence of sound was so complete it caused physical discomfort, like pressure in the ears. The operator stood still, waiting for instructions over the radio. Instead, they heard footsteps. Slow, heavy, approaching from behind. Assuming it was another employee, they turned around and saw no one. The corridor stretched empty in both directions. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, one of them flickering just enough to cast moving shadows along the walls. Then the footsteps started again. This time, they were coming from inside the tunnel wall. The operator left the ride unattended and did not return to work the next day. When management asked why, they cited exhaustion and stress. They did not mention the footsteps. They did not mention that the tunnel wall had been warm to the touch. Stories like this circulated quietly among staff. They were never reported, never documented. Employees who complained too loudly found their hours reduced or their schedules changed without explanation. Those who stayed learned to adapt. They learned which back paths to avoid after dark. They learned which lights flickered in patterns that meant turn around. They learned to ignore sounds that didn't match the visible environment. They learned not to follow voices. One supervisor admitted years later that they used to hear their own name whispered through the park's intercom system. Not over the speakers, but inside the walls. Always late at night. Always when they were alone. When they tried to trace the sound, it stopped. The intercom system had been old even when the park was new. It relied on a network of wires that ran beneath the park, through maintenance tunnels few people ever entered. Schematics were incomplete. Some sections had been added years later without proper documentation, and no one knew exactly how far the system extended. Or what else shared those tunnels. After the night the park stayed open too late, access to the back paths became restricted. Certain doors were locked permanently. Others were boarded over. Maintenance schedules were shortened. Employees were told to stay visible, to use public walkways even when it slowed operations. But the back paths were still there. And sometimes people ended up in them without remembering how. A food stand worker recalled taking trash out near closing time. The dumpsters were located behind the attractions, accessible through a narrow service corridor. They remembered stepping through the door, pulling the bag behind them, and then realizing the corridor looked wrong. Longer than it should have been. Colder, quieter. They walked for several minutes without reaching the dumpsters. The lights overhead changed color as they moved, white to yellow to a faint greenish hue. The walls narrowed slightly, just enough to make breathing feel conscious rather than automatic. When they turned around, the door they had entered through was gone. Panic set in. They began running, trash bag forgotten, footsteps echoing unnaturally loud. The corridor curved, then split, then curved again. Each turn revealed another stretch of identical concrete. Then the music started, faint at first. A cheerful melody, slowed down, warped just enough to feel off. The sound did not come from ahead or behind, but from everywhere at once. The worker covered their ears and kept moving. Eventually, they emerged behind a ride on the opposite side of the park, one they had not worked near that night. According to their watch, only 3 minutes had passed. The dumpsters were still full the next morning. As more employees left, the park struggled to function. Management grew distant, then invisible. Schedules were posted without names attached. Pay discrepancies became common. Entire departments seemed to disappear overnight. Those who remained began to notice gaps, not just in staffing, but in memory. There were rides no one remembered installing, buildings that didn't appear on old maps, paths that only seemed to exist after sunset. Photographs taken during the final months show inconsistencies. In some images, rides appear closer together than they should be. In others, familiar landmarks are missing entirely. One photo, taken from the top of the Ferris wheel shortly before closure, shows a section of the park no former employee can identify. The structures are wrong, taller, darker, arranged in a way that defies the park's known layout. The negative was verified as authentic. No explanation was ever found. Urban explorers who entered the park years later reported finding entrances to the back paths still accessible. Despite decades of neglect, certain doors opened easily. Hinges were not rusted. Locks were missing entirely. Inside, the corridors felt maintained. Not clean, but used. Footprints appeared in dust that should not have been disturbed. Walls showed fresh scratches, layered over older damage. Some lights still worked, powered by an electrical system no one could trace. Explorers described a sensation of being guided. Not physically, but spatially, corridors curved in ways that subtly prevented backtracking. Turns felt natural in one direction, resistant in another. Those who tried to force their way through reported headaches, nausea, and overwhelming anxiety. Many turned back. Those who didn't sometimes heard the intercom. Not announcements. Instructions. One group claimed to hear a voice calmly asking them to please remain in designated areas. Another recorded a message that played backward when analyzed, repeating the same phrase over and over, "You're not supposed to be here yet." The recording ended abruptly, replaced by the sound of machinery starting up. They left the park immediately. None of their footage survived. By the time the town acknowledged the park was never reopening, it had already become something else. Not a failed business, not a nostalgic ruin, but a place that existed in fragments, partially remembered, partially erased, and partially active in ways no one wanted to understand. And beneath it all, behind the rides and beneath the laughter that once defined it, the back paths continued to stretch, longer than they should have been, deeper than anyone remembered. As if the park had learned how to grow inward in the months following the park's sudden closure. Something strange happened to the employment records. They didn't just stop updating. They began to lose information. At first, it was subtle. A missing middle initial, a wrong start date, hours logged under the wrong name, payroll errors that management blamed on a failing accounting system. But when former employees compared notes, they noticed something far more disturbing. Entire names were gone. People who had worked full seasons, sometimes multiple years, could no longer find themselves in any official documentation tied to the park. Their employee IDs returned no results. Their tax forms listed the park under slightly different names. Some records had been altered to suggest they had never worked there at all. IT wasn't everyone, just a few, and all of them had one thing in common. They had worked the night the park stayed open too late. Families began to notice it first. A mother trying to track down her son's final paycheck was told there was no record of him ever being employed. A sister searching for workplace references found her brother's name missing from old schedules she had personally seen years before. When pressed, former managers claimed they didn't remember these people. Not wouldn't remember. Didn't. One supervisor was shown a photograph taken during a staff picnic. Dozens of employees stood together, smiling in the sun. The supervisor could identify nearly everyone, except three figures standing near the edge of the frame. When asked who they were, the supervisor stared at the image for a long time before finally saying, "I don't know why they're there, not who." Why? The missing employees became known, unofficially, as the ones who never clocked out. No time cards marked their final shifts. No terminaste paperwork existed. According to the system, they were still on the clock, permanently assigned to shifts that never ended. Yet, outside the park, they were gone. No confirmed sightings. No addresses. No paper trail. Even their families found gaps in their histories. School records incomplete. Medical files missing, visits that should have been there. It was as if the park hadn't just taken them, it had edited them. One case stands out. A ride operator who had worked the wooden roller coaster for nearly 6 years. Reliable, experienced, known for staying late to help new hires. After the park closed, his parents tried to file a missing person report. The police found nothing. His driver's license had expired months earlier, yet there was no record of renewal or cancellation. His bank account showed activity up until the week of the closure. Then nothing. His social security number flagged as inactive, not missing. Inactive. The officer handling the case later admitted something didn't feel right. Not that the man was gone, but that the system behaved as if he had finished existing. The case was quietly closed. Former coworkers remembered him clearly. They remembered his laugh, his habit of tapping the ride controls twice before starting a cycle, his insistence on checking seat restraints personally, even when management rushed him. They also remembered seeing him after his shift should have ended. On the night, the park stayed open too late. Several employees recalled seeing him walking toward the back paths, not away from the ride, but deeper into the park. He wasn't in uniform. He was still smiling over time. Others came forward. A concession worker last seen restocking a closed stand near midnight. A maintenance tech who answered a radio call no one remembered sending. A security guard whose final patrol route took him beneath the park. All gone. All erased. All connected to places guests never saw. Those who remained employed after the closure noticed something else. Schedules continued to change. Even though the park was locked, old schedule boards still appeared to be updated. Names were added and removed in handwriting that matched no one's. Shifts were listed at impossible times. One former supervisor admitted they returned to the park weeks after closure to retrieve personal belongings. Inside a locked office, they found a clipboard with a schedule dated months into the future. Several names were listed. Some were crossed out. Others were not. Among them was a name the supervisor recognized, someone who had already gone missing. The shift assignment read, position, ride attendant location, tunnel ride hours. Until closed, there was no listed end time. Attempts to investigate further were met with resistance. When families pushed for answers, they were told records had been lost in a flood or a fire or a system migration. Each explanation differed, but the result was the same. No proof, no accountability. And gradually fewer questions. Because asking too many seemed to come with consequences. One former employee who publicly discussed the missing workers experienced a series of incidents. Mail went missing. Phone calls dropped exactly when discussing the park. Strangers showed up at their home asking vague questions about unrelated topics. Eventually, they stopped talking. Another attempted to compile a list of names, those who had vanished, those whose records had changed. Every time they saved the file, entries disappeared. Not deleted, rewritten. Names misspelled just enough to break searches. Dates shifted, locations changed. After the third attempt, the file corrupted itself entirely. They described the experience as trying to write on water. Urban explorers who entered the park years later sometimes reported seeing signs of human presence. Not squatters, not animals, evidence of work, tools placed neatly beside rides, lights turned on in sections that shouldn't have power, fresh chalk marks on concrete floors beneath attractions, and occasionally lockers, old employee lockers that had been moved from their original locations into back corridors. Some were still locked. Inside, explorers found uniforms folded carefully, name tags attached, personal items arranged as if waiting to be reclaimed. None of the names matched existing records. One locker contained a time card. The last punch read, "An 11:47 p.m. There was no corresponding out time." Perhaps the most disturbing reports came from those who claimed to hear voices. Not echoes, not imagination, clear, structured speech. Late at night, near the park's perimeter, residents reported hearing announcements carried on the wind. Not loud enough to understand fully, but unmistakably artificial. The tone was cheerful, rehearsed. "Attention employees." The rest was lost to distance. Those who got closer sometimes heard their own names. People who had never worked at the park. People who had never been inside. It raised an impossible question. What if the park didn't just take those who were there? What if it learned how to recruit? Former employees who dreamed of the park began noticing changes. The dreams lasted longer. The details grew sharper. They could walk through areas they had never physically visited. And in these dreams, the park was operating again. Rides moved. Music played. Lights glowed. But the guests were wrong. They didn't speak. They didn't react. They didn't leave. And the employees working the rides were familiar faces. Faces that should not have existed anymore. One dreamer claimed to recognize themselves. Standing at a control panel, older, tired, still on shift by the time the town council officially declared the property abandoned. The park had already rewritten its own history. Not through force, not through fear, but through absence. People vanished. Quietly, records failed silently, memories softened at the edges. The park did not demand attention. It waited. Because it understood something fundamental: if no one clocks out, the park never truly closes. For years, no outside authority touched the park. Not because there was no reason to, but because every attempt dissolved before it could begin. The property existed in a strange administrative limbo. Ownership records contradicted each other. Zoning documents referenced outdated parcel numbers. Environmental reports were incomplete, filed but never finalized on paper. The park was both abandoned and still under review. It wasn't until a proposal emerged to redevelop the land that outside investigators finally stepped in. The town needed money. Developers wanted space. The park occupied prime real estate, large, flat, and inconveniently close to a growing residential area. Before demolition could begin, a routine geological survey was required. That survey never concluded. The first team arrived in early spring. 3 engineers, 2 environmental consultants, 1 local liaison appointed by the town council. They began with surface testing, soil samples, structural scans, ground-penetrating radar. Nothing unusual at first. Old foundations, buried utility lines, remnants of rides long dismantled or collapsed beneath debris. Then the radar hit something it couldn't map. Beneath the central section of the park, directly under the oldest attractions, the scans showed voids. Not tunnels, not basements, spaces too large and irregular to be explained by construction plans. At first, they assumed outdated blueprints. Early parks were notorious for undocumented modifications. Someone suggested old storm drains or abandoned maintenance corridors. But the shapes didn't match. They overlapped, folded into one another. As if the ground beneath the park had been hollowed out, and then rearranged. Permission was granted to conduct limited excavation. The work began near the tunnel ride, one of the park's earliest attractions and a location frequently mentioned in employee testimonies. Within hours, the crew uncovered a concrete slab that didn't appear on any records. It wasn't part of a ride foundation. It wasn't reinforced. It looked improvised. A hatch was discovered at its center. There was no handle, just a shallow indentation where something had once been. The local liaison reportedly went pale when he saw it. He asked the crew to stop. They didn't. The hatch led downward, not into a tunnel, but into a chamber. The air was stale, warm, and faintly metallic. The walls were concrete, poured in uneven sections, suggesting it had been expanded over time rather than built all at once. There were no signs of recent use. No tools, no trash, no graffiti. But there were markings. lines etched into the walls at shoulder height, repeating in patterns that resembled height measurements. Next to them were symbols, not letters, not numbers, but shapes repeated again and again. Circles intersected by vertical lines, arrows pointing inward, simple figures with exaggerated hands. Some markings were crossed out. Others were layered over older ones. The consultants documented everything. They were told to stop the next day, that night. One of the engineers didn't sleep. He later described hearing machinery, distant, rhythmic, familiar, despite being miles from the site. When he closed his eyes, he saw rotating lights and moving shadows. He called his supervisor before dawn. By the time the rest of the team arrived at the park, he was gone. His rental car remained in the hotel parking lot. His room showed signs of occupancy, but not departure. The bed was unmade. The bathroom light was on. The door was unlocked. The excavation was officially suspended due to safety concerns. Unofficially, the remaining team members were warned not to discuss what they had found. But information leaked. Photographs of the chamber surfaced online briefly before being taken down. The images were low quality, grainy, and poorly lit, but details were visible. Among them was something no one expected: a time clock, mounted to the wall, old, mechanical, still powered. The last punch was recent as word spread. A second investigation was authorized, this time involving state officials. They approached the site more cautiously, sealing off areas and restricting access. Security was posted at the perimeter. They focused on the subsurface anomalies. What they found suggested the chamber was only part of a much larger structure. Beneath the park lay a network, not designed. Accumulated spaces built on top of spaces. Corridors leading nowhere. Rooms without clear purpose. Some areas reinforced, others left raw. The deeper they scanned, the more inconsistent the geometry became. Angles didn't align, levels overlapped. The space beneath the park seemed to ignore basic spatial logic. One official reportedly asked if the radar equipment was malfunctioning. It wasn't. They tried different machines, different operators. The results stayed the same. Then they found something else. Not a room, a boundary at a certain depth. The scans simply stopped. Not because of interference, but because the space beyond could not be resolved. The equipment returned data that contradicted itself, distances that expanded and collapsed depending on the angle of the scan. As if the underground space wasn't fixed. As if it was responding. The investigation was shut down less than a week later. The reason given was environmental instability. The real reason was never documented. But one memo, leaked years later, contained a single line highlighted in red: subsurface activity does not appear inert. After that, the park was reclassified, not as abandoned, but as restricted. No demolition, no redevelopment, no excavation. The land was quietly removed from future planning documents. Its boundaries blurred on updated maps. In some cases, it vanished entirely. People living nearby noticed subtle changes. GPS systems rerouted around the area. New roads curved away from it. Emergency services reported signal loss near the perimeter. The park was becoming difficult to reach. Those who ignored the warnings and entered anyway reported new structures beneath the rides. Staircases that descended farther than expected. Doors that hadn't been there before. Rooms filled with equipment still humming quietly. And in some places, desks, workstations, clipboards, as if operations had simply moved underground. One explorer claimed to find a break room. Vending machines stocked with expired snacks. A microwave that still worked. A bulletin board covered in faded notices. Among them was a printed memo. Reminder: all staff must remain below during extended operation. There was no date, no signature. The most unsettling discovery came from a sealed section beneath the Ferris wheel. Behind a locked door, one that required force to open, was a room filled with monitors. They displayed live feeds, not of the park as it existed, but of the park as it had been. Rides operating, guests moving, employees working. The footage was distorted, looped, and slightly out of sync, but unmistakably active. And among the figures on screen were faces that had been missing for decades, still working, still smiling, still on shift. The feeds shut off when the explorers approached the monitors. The room went dark. Behind them, something moved. They ran. They never returned by the time authorities acknowledged the underground structures publicly. It was already too late. The park had been buried once before, intentionally or not, and it had survived. Now, sealed beneath layers of concrete and denial, it continued to operate in a form no one could fully understand. Not closed, not abandoned, just relocated. Once the underground structures were discovered, the question stopped being what was the park.it became how do you end it? Officially, no one said that out loud. The language used in documents was careful, sanitized, containment, stabilization, risk mitigation. But internally, the intent was clear. The park had to be neutralized, not preserved, not studied indefinitely. Stop. The first attempt was administrative. The property was placed under layered jurisdiction, state, environmental, historical, and safety restrictions stacked on top of one another. Access permits were revoked. Surveillance cameras were installed around the perimeter. Motion sensors were buried near known entry points. For a while, it worked. Trespassing dropped. Reports stopped. The park faded again into silence. Then the cameras began recording movement that didn't match reality. Figures passed through areas with no physical access. Motion sensors triggered without heat signatures. Cameras captured shadows crossing open ground where nothing stood. Technicians blamed software errors. Until the errors started following a schedule every night at exactly the same time. The same sensors activated. Every morning, the same cameras glitched, and every evening, just before the failures began, the park's old music could be faintly heard, picked up by microphones that should have recorded nothing but wind. The playlist was wrong, out of order, incomplete, repeating sections that hadn't played in decades. As if something was testing its systems. The second attempt was physical. Heavy machinery was brought in to collapse key structures. The Ferris wheel was targeted first, both because of its size and its symbolic weight. Demolition crews reported unusual resistance. Bolts that should have loosened snapped instead. Metal warped unpredictably. Cutting tools dulled faster than expected. One worker swore the wheel shifted slightly while no machinery was engaged. They paused work. During that pause, the wheel turned. Just one rotation. No wind, no powered, no explanation. The demolition order was rescinded. Next came fire. Controlled burns were proposed to destroy surface attractions and render the park inert. Environmental approvals were rushed through under emergency provisions. On the scheduled night, crews gathered at the perimeter. They never lit a match, because the park was already burning. Lights flickered on across the grounds, not electrical lights, but the glow of old bulbs warming from within. The smell of hot metal and oil filled the air. Smoke rose from places where no fire should have been possible. And beneath it all, the sound of machinery returned. Not loud, not chaotic, measured, operational. The burn was canceled. No one admitted why. After that, the strategy changed. Instead of destruction, they tried isolation. The surrounding area was altered subtly. Roads rerouted. Signs removed. The park stopped appearing on updated maps. GPS data shifted coordinates just enough to guide people around it instead of toward it. Over time, fewer people stumbled onto it accidentally. The park became harder to find. But it also became harder to ignore, because reports began coming from places that were not near it at all. Former employees experienced something new. They started receiving mail. Not threatening letters, not warnings. Pay stubs, issued decades late, with accurate names, correct employee IDs, Hours logged under positions they once held. The checks could not be cashed. Banks had no record of the issuing entity, but the envelopes were real, postmarked, dated. Some contained handwritten notes. Shift extended, report below. Staff shortage. Those who ignored them began dreaming again. Those who didn't sometimes disappeared. Then came the sightings. People reported seeing small attractions, carnival booths, game stalls, ride entrances, appear temporarily in empty lots, abandoned buildings, even shopping mall parking garages. They never lasted long, just a few hours, just long enough for someone to wander too close. Witnesses described the same details every time. Faded paint, warm lights, music slightly out of tune, and always, somewhere nearby, a path leading behind it. Investigators realized too late what was happening. The park was no longer confined to its original location, and IT was exporting itself. Not physically, but structurally, fragments of it were appearing wherever conditions allowed. Places already forgotten, spaces already neglected, areas no one watched closely. The park wasn't spreading randomly, IT was selecting. A classified report summarized the pattern succinctly. The site demonstrates adaptive persistence. Containment efforts accelerate external manifestation. In simpler terms, trying to shut it down made it grow. The final attempt was secrecy. All documentation was classified. Online references were scrubbed. Discussions were redirected or dismissed as urban legend. Former employees were quietly discouraged from speaking. And for a while, that worked. Because the park did not need belief. It needed participation. Deep beneath the original site, activity increased. Power consumption rose despite no visible output. Heat signatures fluctuated in regular cycles. The underground spaces rearranged themselves, closing some corridors and opening others. And in the deepest levels, beyond where scans could resolve, something reached a state investigators described only as operational stability, which meant one thing. The park had enough staff. The last recorded incident tied to official efforts occurred when a small team attempted to seal a newly discovered access point beneath the old parking lot. They descended with equipment, sealed doors behind them, and maintained radio contact for 12 minutes. Then the music started. The transmission filled with applause, cheering at a crowd that shouldn't have existed, and a voice over the intercom, clear and calm. "Thank you for staying late." The line went dead. The access point collapsed hours later without explanation. NO bodies were recovered. NO names were released after that. No one tried again. Because by then, it was obvious. You don't shut down a place like that. You leave, you forget, and you hope it doesn't remember you. Today, the park is not marked on any official map. It does not appear in zoning records, tourism guides, or development plans. Satellite images blur strangely over the area, as if the resolution drops just enough to make details unreliable. Aerial surveys avoid the airspace entirely, rerouted by algorithms that cannot explain why, and yet, the park still exists. Not as it once was: loud, crowded, visible, but as something quieter, patient. Waiting. People who live near the original site describe changes that are easy to dismiss in isolation. Streetlights flicker at night in patterns that feel intentional. Old melodies drift through open windows on windless evenings. Power outages follow a rhythm that no utility company can explain. Children sometimes ask questions their parents don't know how to answer. Why is there a Ferris wheel behind the trees? Who's working at the place with the lights? Why do they keep calling your name? The parents say there is no park. They say it closed a long time ago. And most of the time, that's enough. But some people receive invitations. They arrive quietly, slipped under doors, delivered to inboxes that should no longer exist, printed on paper no store sells anymore. They do not say you are invited. They say, "Welcome BACK," even when the recipient has never been there before. The invitations are always specific. They reference shifts never worked, Positions never held. Routes through the park that feel familiar anyway. Some include maps, not accurate ones, not complete ones, just enough to get you started. Those who ignore the invitations often report the same progression of events. First, the dreams return. Not vague nightmares, structured experiences. They arrive at the park just before closing. They are given instructions. They are told everything will be quick. Then, the waking signs begin. Clocks run late. Time slips during routine tasks. Music appears where silence should be. Eventually, ignoring the invitation becomes harder than accepting it. Because the park has learned something essential. People don't need to believe in it. They only need to remember it. Urban explorers still attempt to find the original site. Most fail. Those who succeed describe a park that looks maintained. Not restored. Not repaired. Maintained. Weeds trimmed just enough to reveal paths. Lights replaced selectively. Rides stabilized without signs of modern intervention. And the gates, once rusted shut, now open. Easily. Sometimes, they are already opened. Inside, the park is wrong in subtle ways. The layout feels familiar but inconsistent. Distances stretch. Paths curve back into themselves. The air smells like warm oil and old sugar. Music plays, always slightly out of sync, and there are people. Not guests, employees. They wear uniforms from different eras, all mixed together. Some look decades out of place. Others look newly arrived, confused, pale, trying to remember when they agreed to stay late. They do not speak unless spoken to. When they do, they use rehearsed phrases. Enjoy your visit. Please remain in designated areas. Closing has been delayed. Their eyes follow movement too smoothly. Deep inside the park, beyond the public attractions, operations continue. The underground levels are larger now. Expanded, organized, efficient. New corridors branch outward, reaching toward places that were never meant to connect. Monitoring stations track activity above ground. Schedules are printed daily. Names appear on them. Some belong to people who are still alive. For now, the time clock still works. IT always works. IT records entries automatically. NO card required. NO consent needed. Investigators who quietly monitor anomalous sites have noticed a troubling trend. Disappearances no longer cluster around the park itself. They occur near temporary attractions. Pop-up events. Forgotten fairgrounds. Abandoned malls hosting seasonal festivals. Anywhere a structure invites joy, without permanence. Anywhere people are encouraged to stay just a little longer. The park does not need its original location anymore. IT was only a starting point, a prototype, a proof of concept. Former employees who are still alive sometimes wake up with dirt under their fingernails. Some find uniforms folded at the foot of their beds. Others notice their reflections lag slightly behind their movements, as if rehearsing. A few have stopped sleeping altogether. Because in their dreams, the park is fully operational now. Bright, crowded, endless. Most recent confirmed report came from a security camera in a decommissioned transit station. For exactly 4 minutes, the feed showed a familiar structure being assembled at a ticket booth. String lights, painted signage, and behind it all, a gate swinging opened. A group of people entered. None of them came back out. The footage corrupted itself immediately afterward, so if you ever find yourself somewhere that feels strangely festive for a place that should be empty, if you hear music playing where there are no speakers, if a path appears behind a structure that wasn't there before, do not follow it. Because the park is still hiring, and once you clock in, the shift never ends.